Welcome to the Carter Center's Forum on Human Rights. My name is Josh Griffin, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. May 25th, 2022 marked the 2-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. In the days following Mr. Floyd's death, the world witnessed millions of people take to the streets protesting for Black lives. The world echoed with slogans of "Say his name" or "I can't breathe." As the years passed, so has the trend of supporting Black lives. In 2 years, the world has moved on from millions of people protesting the killing of George Floyd to cities painting over Black Lives Matter murals and focusing on other newsworthy events like the war in Ukraine. The frustration of rights activists has been exacerbated by the political failures, such as the inability for Congress to pass H.R. 40, coupled with the persistent killings of innocent Black lives, often at the hands of the police. The erasure of Black and minoritized Americans is a concerning phenomenon with far-reaching consequences, not only for those most affected by the injustice for the United States and for the United States as a whole. The time is now to take intentional action to advocate and fight for Black and minoritized lives. Today's roundtable will focus on living beyond social trends. As you listen to this conversation, I ask you to look inward and identify your role in the fight for social change. Joining us today, we have Dr. Kristian Jones, Associate Professor at the University of Washington School of Social Work. His program of research examines how youth mentoring can be utilized to promote positive outcomes for Black youth. His current research focuses on how community-based youth mentoring programs promote social justice in the communities they serve. As a Black male scholar, his research is grounded in his passion for equity and inclusion, specifically as it relates to marginalized youth. Thank you for being here, Kristian. Lorrie Lynn King is an instructor in the Masters in Development Practice program at Emory University. For 25 years, Lorrie King has traversed applied academic and philanthropic settings in the fields of public health and humanitarian response, concentrating her study and expertise in the realms of decolonization, indigenous sovereignty, gender-informed WASH, refugee resettlement, and HIV/AIDS. Thank you both for taking the time to be in conversation and community with me and the Carter Center. So we're gonna get straight into the questions. So this whole idea of social trends, right? Or living beyond social trends, what does that mean to you? How does your positionality shape your understanding of this term? How does living beyond social trends show up in your scholarship, in your research, and in the classroom?
Well, I can go first real quick. First off, I'm really happy to be here. Just to clarify, I'm an assistant professor, not an associate professor. I'm not tenured, hopefully one day, Lord willing. But to me, my biggest identity that really impacts the way that I see the world is being Black, specifically a Black man, more specifically a Black man from the South, more specifically being a Black man from the suburbs of Atlanta, Marietta specifically. So all of these different identity markers really shape how I view the world. And for me, living beyond social trends just simply means caring after an event has happened, caring when news is no longer covering an event. I've been deeply shaken by the shootings, all the shootings, but specifically Buffalo really tore me up. And then the shooting on Uvalde was just tough. So I'm really happy to be having these conversations and hopefully think about some ways that we can make some sustainable and long-lasting impact and change, because something has to give. I personally can't do stuff like this anymore for my own mental health. I don't think it's sustainable for any and all of us. So very happy to be here and talk about ways we can make some positive changes.
Thank you. And Lorrie, same question to you.
Well, thank you, Josh and Kristian. It is an honor and a pleasure to share time and space with you today. I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge where I am right now. I am joining you from Metro Atlanta. I am living, learning, and working on the unceded lands of the Muskogee people, on the lands where Black Americans descendants of African slaves continue to be tortured and oppressed and modern day lynched, where there's ongoing harm. I live in the town of Decatur, which also employed a system of Saturday school to keep Jewish people from living here as early or as late as the 30s and 50s. I think as somebody who works in the field of academia, I also have to acknowledge the positionality that the institution of academia has been used as a tool of colonization and oppression. It has also been used as a gatekeeping tool, and we have to start there. I think that an empowering thing to do is to return to an indigenized mindset of I have obligations rather than I have rights, a return to a collective responsibility. My Jewish identity also compels me to live into the ethos that just because the work of justice will not be completed in my lifetime, neither am I free to abandon it. I come from an Irish father and a Mizrahi Sephardic Jewish mother. That means that our family roots are found in the Middle East and North Africa. As a young child, people often mistook my mother for the nanny. And I had no idea what that meant, but I just knew that because she had long black hair and dark skin, that people thought she was from somewhere else, and that meant something. And I never stopped thinking about that. So from an early age, I had an awareness that how someone looked shaped the public's perception of them and what their station in life was and what that meant for their place, like as a mom, just hanging out with me in the park.
Thank you for that insight of both who you are, your positionality, and how that definitely influences how you move and navigate the world. One thing I want to mention too is if you'd like to ask questions to today's guest, you can do so by joining the forum on human rights. The field should be on the right side of your page. So we'd love to be able to get the audience involvement in today's conversation. One thing that really stuck out to me, as you both spot kind of an overarching theme, is just this idea of community, right? How it seems like you very much know communities that you belong to. For the both of y'all, what does it mean to be in relationship with a community and communities, and how can that kind of help with identifying social trends and moving beyond that?
Yeah, this is something I think about all the time, specifically living in Seattle. This is one of the more unique cities I've lived in, and I've been privileged to live across the US and travel outside a little bit. Um, I think community is largely impacted by the identities you hold. So, for example, I'm not particularly a religious person, so I don't really seek community from church often. And I find that it's pretty difficult to be a Black person in a city like Seattle if you're not connected to um, a church, or people who are from here. So it's been pretty difficult to build community, but I think being as intentional as possible has really helped. I think also recognizing that I'm not from here and it's going to take longer. And I think also recognizing that you can't force community, it has to be organic. And I think the fact that people who aren't from certain communities and try to make decisions for them, I think that's where a lot of friction comes in. So just really taking it day by day and trying to figure out like how can I do my best to make the most of the place I'm living in. But it's difficult, more difficult than I've experienced in other cities. For example, I lived in Cookeville, Tennessee. Cookeville's in between Nashville and Knoxville, and Cookeville, I want to say, is like 85% white. And I have felt more comfortable there than I do in Seattle a lot of the times. And I find that it's because I'm Southern. I love the South. I love the food. I love the culture. I love the people. So what community looks like largely is dictated by your identities. And then impacts like how you can organize and promote social justice in your community. So the more you think about the community, the more complicated it gets. So I would love to hear from Lorrie to think about like, how do you build community in a community that you're not from, and what does that look like so you're not imposing on people's um, what they view community from your past experiences.
I think it's such an interesting question because many times you're also building community from within the social groups or the communities that you're in. And, I'll speak to an issue that is often very polarizing within Jewish communities. And it doesn't matter, your ethnicity within a Jewish community. If you're Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, it doesn't matter if you're Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist, and that is the issue of Israel and Palestine. If you want to scatter or just throw lighter fluid and matches over a family gathering, just bring up the P word, right? And right. And that can be very hard to build community, within your own temple, your synagogue, your Havarah, because people often dance around it, right? Like it is an elephant within the room. I hearken back to just my experience of this. I remember reading it in a literature class. In undergrad, I read Camus' book, The Stranger, right? And he brings up the point of, the victim is also the executioner who never had the chance, right? And many times with this specific issue, people rush to make a judgment without being fully informed. I mean, isn't that the thing with like so much of what we're talking about with trends in social justice, with disparities? People will vote against their own self-interest. I remember, about a year and a half ago, a sociologist writer by the name of Jonathan Metzl wrote a book called Dying of Whiteness, and it's an exploration of how health trends in the Midwest have been shaped by voters voting against their own best interest. So is the same in many Jewish communities, where people will just grab onto, this Zionistic version of their identity that is uninformed by history, right? And it has been hijacked. Zionism itself used to be a beautiful thing. Did you know that the song Somewhere Over the Rainbow was actually written about the dream of a Jewish homeland where Jewish people would not be persecuted? And what has happened over time is people have started conflating their Jewish identity, their religious practice, with an undying commitment to what I personally believe, what I have experienced in my work in the realms of public health and development, working in the occupied Palestinian territories, is an apartheid state. Amnesty International released a super damning report last year about this, right? There is a wonderful writer by the name of Rashid Khalidi who wrote this book called The 100 Years War on Palestine, right? It's absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend it. But it causes one to have to interrogate their own positionality, right? For me, something I've never been able to reconcile is a Jewish person who spent a lot of time. My undergraduate honors thesis was written on genocide. I have never been able to reconcile the fact of people conflating their identity as a person, right? Their religious identity or their ethnic identity as a Jewish person, just conflating it with a state government, right? Like it's just like, oh, I must be pro this state simply because of who I am, without interrogating what that means for other people, or other people. For me, it would be the same thing as, going back to Ireland and saying, my dad's family lived here like 100 years ago. So I'm here now. It would be like super great if you all could just get out because, we're back. And so the constant thinking like of this like cyclical movement and the blindness to just like buying into like a party line or something that used to be beautiful that's been turned around my head spins all the time. And so, Kristian, I really appreciate you sharing, what you were saying, just like how as a Black man, how it's hard for you to reconcile these things and to even like find peace within just existing. So for me, it's very hard sometimes to find peace in existing within my own community because of this and because my stance of it. Also just the way I look, I talked about my mother earlier, being a brown skinned person. I'm a very tattooed person. So like there's another lighter fluid and matches things in my community. But I do hearken back to, something that I also read, like, William Blake, I think, said it in his book, Jerusalem. It's like, you must work from within to create the system that undoes the system, right? And I think that is a long game. And so, because of like a colonial heteropatriarchy mindset, people are often like rushing to conquer, right? Like we're making decisions right now. The change is happening right now because I said it, we're pushing it through, and people don't stop to listen. They don't stop to consider. It's just a rush through. So I'm going to stop talking right now because I think I over answered that question.
No, I think that was a great response. For me, just sitting here and listening to the both of you all, and not sorry, but the sun's finally out here in the Pacific Northwest, so you see a little bit of a glare, just soaking up that vitamin D. But I'm just sitting here and just thinking about how knowing oneself really shows up. It seems as if, while you talk, is just really knowing who you are, your identities, all your various intersectionalities seem to assist you in navigating communities and identifying communities you belong to. And in a previous conversation, Lorrie, you mentioned the book, the Black Agenda. And I've been reading that lately. And I think for me, it's helped me to be able to look within myself and to be able to understand how this country really wasn't built for my upward mobility. I am biracial, but I'm a Black male. And so being able to really distill down, these various institutions and the political systems and how politic to continue to oppress us, and to be able to glorify capitalism, and the one percenters. So I think my follow-up question as I go on my long tangent is, how can a community, live beyond social trends, right? How can you really build a community to fight back and to resist these systems of oppression, to be able to move beyond you putting a sign that aligns you with a trend or a movement? How can you bring a community together and to be able to fight back? Are there any examples that y'all might have of that?
Well, my immediate example is just the Black Panthers and all the amazing work that they were able to do in the late 60s and early 70s. And the fact that free lunch programs in schools across the country that stemmed from the Black Panthers providing free breakfast and lunch to people in their community. So to me, that's the first thing I thought of, specifically being a Black person who's very into history and very into social justice. I think there's some incredible examples within the movements that they were doing. But to your point,
Kristian, real quickly though, what about for people that automatically view Black Panthers as a militant group? What would you say to that? The people that focus on that aspect, how the news might glorify that. How can somebody look past that, or to really see the community work?
Well, one, the more that I learn about history, the more I realize how complicated history should be, because it really should be told from different perspectives. So for people to kind of question, if you get a certain perspective, who is it coming from? And getting accounts from people who are either a part of the Black Panthers or a part of the communities that they were serving. And then two, I think another big thing to consider for that question specifically is it bad to be militant? I think there's a time and place for everything, but there's different ways to achieve a goal. And for people to act like, oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. Well, if I've been doing this and it's not working, then, obviously I'm going to switch up and do something that's going to work better for me and my community. Specifically for Black folks in this country. And again, I reference Black history a lot because not only am I Black, but my grandmothers have just poured so much Black history in me, I can't help it. But even thinking about like Nat Turner, thinking about slave revolts and like resisting through being militant and all of the value that comes from that, and thinking about Malcolm X and all the great activists that have come through who have pushed back actively, and with force, and the value that brings. So there's a lot of different ways to reach a goal for sure.
I think one thing that has haunted me, where I've really started to do self-interrogation about this, was coming into the academic year after the murder of George Floyd. And ironically, I was gearing up to teach a class called Decolonizing Development. You know, sometimes you can't make this up, right? And I could not escape the thought that, you know, here I live in Atlanta, as I mentioned earlier. And so, you know, we had mass protests. People were painting the Black Lives Matter murals everywhere, you know, and this was as COVID was really starting to take off. And I had this thought: if people weren't sitting at home without the normal distractions they have, you know, sports games, concerts, bars, the movies, dining out, would they have been in the street so much? Would they have been taking this on? During that summer, I remember listening to a Black activist say, you know, most white people have a 90-day shelf life when it comes to protest, when it comes to taking on an issue. The real test is going to be 2 years from now. And that's haunting. And I think they're 1,000% right. You know, if you looked at, I remember Indeed.com, the jobs website, released a report in 2021 that said between May of 2020 and May of 2021, there had been 123% rise in diversity, equity, and inclusion hires. Dr. Leroy Littlebear from the University of Alberta in the Indigenous Studies Department brings up the point that there was a rush for institutions, including academia, to, quote, indigenize before they decolonized. You know, what did that mean? It means that not simply putting somebody in a space where they're the seat warmer. You know, if you hired a woman of color to be the head of the department, does she actually have decision-making capabilities, or is she being gate-kept? Does she have access to the resources that she needs? It's not enough to just do these things. It's the interrogation of a greater system. And it also involves asking the question, who is not here? Not just looking around the room and being self-congratulatory. Oh, look, I've got an Asian person sitting here, and there's a Jewish person here, and there's a Black man sitting here. It's asking the question, who is not here? Whose voices aren't being represented here? And not just represented, but actually listened to and given the resources and the decision-making capabilities. For me as an instructor, I began looking at my classroom as a place of revolution, right? Asking myself, if I could go back in time, what do I wish I had known? What do I wish I would have deconstructed, right? Kind of adopting the ethos of, you know, being who you needed when you were younger. And as important as it is of passing, you know, history, I could bring in somebody to talk about the power of the Black Panther movement. But you don't need to hear it from the nice Jewish lady. You need to hear it from somebody involved in the Black Panther movement. You know, you need to hear from somebody having the lived experience of something. Instead of not just assigning my students to read this book, having Rashid Khalidi himself be there to speak for himself, or having somebody from the Palestinian Policy Network in my classroom sharing about their lived experience of living under apartheid, right? It's also being willing to engage in conversation and thoughtful dialogue with people who think differently than you do, which is something that we've completely lost. We no longer transcend the polarization of things. I mentioned my dad earlier. He was, as you can imagine, growing up in Oregon, he was a cowboy. We probably watched every Western and war movie. You'd be hard pressed to, mention one I probably hadn't watched. But I just remember one. I think it was the Patton movie about General George Patton. But there's this scene where he pops up out of his tank and he's screaming across the front line, "Hey, Rommel, I read your book," right? And I even thought about that as a kid. I was like, wow, like he read the book, the war strategies, the tactics of the other guy. Why? So that he could understand him and know how to engage with him. And I think that's something that has been totally lost. So to just, recap, for me, it's a constant interrogation of, I made a syllabus that has like no non-people of color. So basically like no Eurocentric people. It's all BIPOC people. For my decolonizing development class, it's passing the mic, bringing people in and introducing that. And so again, it's like asking who's not here and who needs to be telling the story. I think, are you engaging those people? I think it's like listening and learning when to kind of like STFU. Right. And just get yourself out of the way. But you can also use your power and your positionality, as an educator to do that. What are the things that I can do? And so that's how I've kind of like just heaped responsibility back on myself.
I like that a lot. For me too, is just like having ascended to various positions that I haven't always seen myself reflected in. And being able to hear the majority, usually white people, take up space at times and to like lean in. And then when I might call them out, they're quick to be defensive and not lean into those moments of discomfort. I really appreciate that, you've taken the time, both of you all taking the time to really know your positionality, to be able to lean in and to pass the mic and to involve others who have an expertise in that and can bring a new perspective into the various contexts in which you both work in. We have an audience question, but I really want to ask a question that I think aligns to what you both were getting at. And it comes from an op-ed written by Charles M. Blow. His May 20th, 2022 op-ed he wrote, last year, we saw a record number of police shootings, the most since the Washington Post began keeping count in 2015. The police killed 1,055 people across the country in 2021, and yet there were no nationwide protests. So my question is it possible to create sustainable change without anybody else getting killed? Or will more George Floyd types death need to occur for transformative social change to come about?
Honestly, I don't think it's possible right now, or else change would have happened before. And to link it to the question from the audience, it's funny, I was just having this conversation with a good friend of mine. I was telling them, like, it's really shocking to me that there's not more solidarity between racialized, minoritized folks in this country, because we've all been screwed over in some type of way. Starting with the indigenous folks who had their land stolen and were given blankets with smallpox, which is like insane, and my ancestors being enslaved, and Asian Americans working on the railroad, and Latin immigrants working in fields, and how all of us are being screwed over. And it's just a little disheartening that there's not more solidarity between all of us. And I think a movement that was really picking up steam and is still trying to keep the momentum going is the Poor People's March, and really centering people who have the shared identity of being in poverty and being impoverished, and what that means for them and their life opportunities and the life outcomes. And I think finding shared identities is really the key to really finding ways to collaborate across different communities, because we might think we have a lot of differences, which we do, but there's also a lot of similarities. of being oppressed in a white supremacist society. I think really finding those similarities, honoring them, and really honoring the differences as well. I have mixed feelings.
Yeah,
Oh, no, go ahead.
how did people go about doing that, right? How do minoritized communities take the time to be able to identify these various intersectionalities that we have? How can these communities do that?
I think conversations like this and like me going to Chinatown and like sitting in on a meeting, or people from North Seattle coming in South Seattle and seeing what's going on down here. I just think
What would you say if somebody says like, well, like I'm afraid to go to those areas? What would you say to them?
I don't think they're ready for to have the conversation then. If someone is, I think it's different stages, and we have to get people who are ready to actually make a change, and then just plant seeds for those who aren't ready. I kind of think we spend too much time trying to educate people who aren't ready to be educated, and that's on a lot of different things, whether that's racism, sexism, um, the privilege of being a heterosexual man. Like, I don't think I would have been as receptive to learning about my privileges as a heterosexual man as a high schooler versus now. So just planting seeds, meeting people where they're at, but at the same time, picking those people who are ready to actually make a change. There's a lot of white people out here that I've talked to that have really grappled with their white privilege, white guilt, and want to do something with that guilt versus white people who are not, they're not there yet. So not, you know, love them, meet them where they're at if you have the capacity and patience for that. But then also there are people who are ready. So focusing on those people instead of trying to convince people that our lives matter.
Lorrie, to you, same question, or just pick off of.
Yeah, like high five, like all of that, everything Kristian just said. I think that I 1,000% agree. No, it is not possible to have change and revolution without violence. And even as we're sitting here, the system that we live in, white supremacy, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, that's violence. That is violence. You know what? Our cell phones are violence. The minerals that it takes to run our cell phones is made off of violence in the continent of Africa, right? The mining of the minerals that are needed is child labor. I think that since the 1960s, and this was intentional, there have been the movement away from each other with these disparate groups instead of back toward each other. And I think that was very intentional. And as my colleague Kristian has said, knowing history is extremely important, right? History is the specter of what we are living today. And you're never going to be able to backtrack that or move it forward without understanding what made it. What we understand today as the nonprofit industrial complex really came into the forefront during the 60s and 70s as groups like the women's movement, Black liberation, the American Indian movement, fill in the blank, queer liberation, right? There was marching in the streets together. Collective liberation was the thing. And, how are you going to fund that? I highly recommend a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded that explores the history of this, because the enforcement of making people come together in like nonprofit structures, you all of a sudden are fighting over the same pot of money. It becomes competition, just like we were saying earlier. It's not coming together. There's $200,000 out here, which is a finite mindset, which is, again, like looking back, it's a colonial mindset, right? You have a finite thing. There's only this piece of pie. If you take a piece, that means I have less of the pie, instead of like we're sharing this pie together. But now people are fighting for the same resources. And so when you're fighting just to keep the lights on, it's also a form of trauma, of scarcity, of reliving just constant survival, right? Are you plotting the revolution, or are you worried about making payroll next week? What are you doing? Those kinds of things were intentional, right? How do you sit and be with people who are different than you? I really appreciated what Kristian was saying about, going, if you're from North Seattle, go to South Seattle, just go and sit and be with people. The theologian Henri Nouwen, who I absolutely love, wrote something that has stuck with me for a number of years. And he said, sometimes I just think the simplest form of spreading the gospel or spreading the likeness of God is to simply sit and get to know my neighbor, right?
Absolutely.
And that is absolutely true. And I think at the end of the day, we have much more in common than we do have that is different. One of the things that I have done to try to live into this, as we talked about at the beginning of our call, I acknowledge that I live and work and teach on the land of the Muskogee people. And so I think about the students in my classroom or the people at my temple, like the circles of influence that I might have, right? I'm like, but how many people have actually met a Muskogee person? Not one. I'll go ahead and answer that for you, because they were all forcibly removed and don't live here anymore. So what can I do with that? I organized last year a dialogue series called the Jewish Indigenous Alliance. Thinking about those small things that we can do to simply facilitate like crossing that line. But as Kristian said, if people aren't at the place where they can receive that knowledge or want to be into it, or they start the what about stuff, they're not ready. And that's okay. You just simply move in the circles and do what you can do.
Absolutely. So I gotta tell a story real fast, and it will be short because I could be long-winded. I remember one time it happened to be in Michigan, and I was staying somewhere in a pretty liberal place, and I was getting ready to go into Detroit with somebody who I'd seen at the time, and a family member told us to be safe and be careful which neighborhood you go to, which meant I took that as don't go to the rough parts of town. And my mindset is, if you have the ability to know certain things happen in these communities and you're afraid to go there, imagine living in that. Imagine if that was your reality, and what would you do? What would you want other people to do so that this community doesn't look like this, so that everybody wants to come here? And I think that's what both Lorrie and Kristian are speaking to, is to lean into that discomfort and ask yourself, why do I feel this way? And to be able to know the role that you play in changing these systems that make us think the way that we do. I do want to acknowledge the question that Kristian had pointed out from the audience and bring it to you, Lorrie, and feel free, Kristian, to hop back on that, is how can you best support a community that you don't necessarily identify with?
I would like to drill that down, like in the sense of engaging with that community, or what I can give, a few examples. I had the great privilege for several years of working for a foundation where, as my former colleague would call me, the benevolent overlord of the sustainable development portfolio. And that covered exactly what it sounds like: community health and development projects that ended up spanning over 30 countries and 15 indigenous nations. And I think it is looking and having the awareness of like the great responsibility that bears. And so again, asking like, where is the money not going? Where are the resources not going? I felt the personal responsibility. I'm like, how can I invest in the occupied Palestinian territories? How can I invest in indigenous communities? How can I invest in Black communities? How can I invest in refugee and immigrant communities? It is using that. It is also learning to listen. There has been a movement now, and this is one of the positive outcomes I think that has happened in the world of philanthropy since the murder of Mr. Floyd, was all of a sudden the awareness, right? Like there was that rush of like, oh my God, like the worst thing that you can call a white organization or a white-led organization or a white person is like racist, right? It's like, hey, we're not racist. Look, like we're supporting this. Like we're giving to Black communities. We're giving to indigenous communities. We're giving to refugee communities, right? But there are still the strings attached to it. You still want to see a report. You still want to have the metrics of how your organization thinks that change is measured, instead of asking the communities, what does change look like to you? What do you need to have resource to make change in your community? Because as Kristian just said, The people who are living in those settings, they know what they need best. And so you go to them and you ask, and you learn how to listen, right? You listen and get yourself out of the way. And sometimes you make it rain when you can, right?
Definitely.
And it can be like small things that people get so overwhelmed now, right? And I mean, it is overwhelming. Like Kristian said, like, this is not sustainable for anyone. The current reality in which we are all a part, like I'm exhausted. So, I mean, if I can't imagine what, my darker skinned colleagues go through. Like, I can't even imagine.
Absolutely. Real quick, I wanted to bring in Kristian to the conversation, be able to speak to the center that you work with at the University of Washington. I think some of your work might kind of speak to this we're talking about right now.
Yeah, so I have the privilege of working with the Social Development Research Group, which is a research institute that focuses on promoting positive youth development and preventing detrimental outcomes such as like school dropout, drug misuse, overdose, things of that nature. And one thing I was thinking about while Lorrie was talking was just the importance of listening, and then also thinking about that's the value of allyship, or the potential value of allyship, when you come in as this person with genuine intentions and just willing to learn. And once you figure out what the issue is in certain communities from people's perspectives, then allocating resources to help them fix their own issues. Because I find that people who are oppressed from a lot of different perspectives tend to have so much knowledge and wisdom to offer. It's just they're not often asked about their perceptions or their solutions to the issues in their community. So trying to reallocate resources, whether that's just giving people money straight up, whether that's shedding light on an issue that's often overlooked. So I think that's one of my favorite things about being at the University of Washington, is just creatively thinking, how can I reallocate resources, at the very least, like shed light on issues that aren't often talked about mainstream.
No, I like that. And Lorrie, how does, like, with the reallocation of resources show up with your work with the indigenous communities that you do your work with?
As Kristian was just talking, one of the things I was thinking of are social outcomes, which create, one of the things that money does in the society is it creates options and opportunities, right? Naomi Klein wrote about that in her tome called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, looking at communities, for example, say in Southern California where wildfires happen, those who can afford to have their own fire department on call to come and spray fire retardant on their homes. Don't take my word for this, Google this, okay? Fire retardant on their homes. And then you get these aerial pictures, right? There's all these burned houses around them. And then there's like, 2 or 3 like standing because they had this special thing. It's much the same with how resources are allocated across different communities, right? Kristian mentioned earlier the intentional and ongoing genocide of indigenous people, right? Like starting back, when settlers came to this continent, the giving of smallpox blanket. How is that like played out to present day? Well, indigenous youth ages 15 to 24 have the second highest demographic in the United States of attempted and completed suicide. Why? Well, according to the Indian Health Service and the American Psychological Association, it's traced back to not having a sense of rootedness and identity, a fractalized sense of self, right? A sense of not having hope or not having a future beyond right now because of the exclusion of resources and the exclusion of being able to participate in opportunities and engage with it on your own terms, right? You've got things like we're finding now, which we knew, of course, mass graves of Indigenous children forcibly removed. So, what can you do? Well, you can find organizations that are actively working to build up Indigenous youth. I have the privilege of working with the Lakota Youth Center in McLaughlin, South Dakota, lakotayouth.org. Highly recommend checking them out. But it is jumping in and sometimes going deeper rather than wider, if that makes sense, right? There's a trend in philanthropy of like, oh, I'm going to give a grant for 1 year or 2 years, instead of partnering with a grassroots organization that needs support and needs partnership and saying, I'm going to partner with you for 5 years, right? No strings attached. Here's $100,000 every year for the next 5 years. It is turning it around for a sense of what Edgar Villanueva calls like reparative and restorative philanthropy. And yes, I do mean like reparative as in like reparations. I think that is a responsibility that we all have.
And I want to jump in real quick and just add, thinking about moving past social trends, one thing I've been really disappointed in, specifically with just the vaccine rollout, for example, just the lack of acknowledgement of history and why certain populations and certain demographics of people are hesitant of vaccines or very hesitant of the medical field. And I don't remember too many government officials acknowledging that, instead of just blaming people for not taking the vaccine and being selfish. There's very real reasons for Black folks to be hesitant of medicine, whether it's the Tuskegee experiment or whether it's Black folks being experimented on by doctors during slavery and during the Reconstruction era. So I think moving past social trends, a lot of that is looking back on our history, specifically in this country, and contextualizing things with the interesting history that we have, and understanding why people behave the way they do, why communities behave the way they do, and thinking about a way to heal from that and repair the damage that's been done.
Thank you both. I'm learning so much just from listening to you all. I'm loving this this conversation and building community amongst ourselves. So you all might know, might not know, but I write poetry, and I used to really be heavily involved into it. And I recently started taking a poetry class where I live. And I'm also critically conscious. Kristian and I have talked about, being critically conscious also. And I live in Seattle, which to me is very performative with its liberal folks that live here. Each city, I once lived in Atlanta and in Seattle. Currently, each city have, Black Lives Matter murals painted on the street. So just think about that. People make the conscious choice to paint Black Lives Matter on a street. I don't really know what that means in the long term, but I want to, read from that op-ed that I had mentioned earlier, and then ask you both a question. Activists soon pointed out that politicians who supported the art often resisted policies designed to correct the historic injustices Black Lives Matter had highlighted. When the District of Columbia, Atlanta, and Seattle painted its mural, the local Black Lives Matter chapter called it a performative distraction from real policy change, designed to appease white liberals while ignoring our demands. Mayor Muriel Bowser was on the wrong side of history, they said. Black Lives Matter means to fund the police. So as I mentioned, Seattle, DC, and Atlanta, and many cities across this country have those very, very murals painted in their streets for people to see that these people stand for Black Lives Matter. Yet the organization never demanded people to take paintbrushes and paint the streets. So my question is, how can people in cities move beyond the performance and into demanding and generating real policy change that corrects the historic injustice Black and minoritized communities have experienced?
I think it just comes down to listening. I really think it's just that simple, listening to communities and their demands, especially when the demands are laid out, and having a conversation about like, how can we perform the actions that they've laid out. But I think
To follow up real quickly, sorry to cut you off, but when people haven't listened, how do you get them to listen, right?
That's exactly what I was about to say. So I've referenced the civil rights movement a lot, but I was really amazed the first time I read about the boycott movement and how people really collectively and strategically just stopped riding the bus, and how eventually the city of Montgomery had to listen to people because they were losing out on so much money. So living in a capitalist society, I mean, I think the thing that makes people care is money, unfortunately. So just thinking about a way to strategically boycott and utilize our resources together as a community. So that, and then this aligns with a question from the audience, thinking about if we can truly make this long systemic change without government funding. And I have mixed feelings about that. I think it's ideally the government would step in, specifically for some of the issues that are happening across the country, houselessness, the rising cost of living. It's crazy how much it costs to live now. But just thinking about, is that realistic, since they've let all of us down so many times? So I think if we pull the resources we have amongst each other in a very strategic and intentional way, we could actually fix a lot of issues. So for the boycott example in Montgomery, Black people and white people who did have cars actually gave people rides. So even something small as that, not just worrying about yourself and how you can get to work, but thinking about how you can use your resources to help those around you as well. I think a more collectivist approach to our problems would go a long, long way to solving them.
Absolutely. And I think that I am as skeptical as you are, Kristian, about government doing something. I think there has been a collective amnesia because in this country, people have gotten fat and happy, so to speak, and people don't worry about something until it's affecting them. It's like, oh, look, a problem now, right? But people have forgotten that politicians work for them. In this capitalistic society, as you have pointed out, like hitting people in the pocketbook is what gets their attention, right? Like boycott, divestment, sanctions. That was, I remember in the civil rights movement, was it Operation Breadbasket or Operation Breadbox, where it was like also a boycott of like stores and bakeries. It's like, respect my dollar, respect my person. You want my money for your bread, but you don't want to employ people from my community to work here? Nah, we're not doing that, right? So it is joining together. I'm a big fan of mutual aid initiatives and communities like returning to that. There is, in great societies everywhere, look across many tribal communities across Africa, there is still the idea, as there is in coastal Salish communities in the Pacific Northwest, the idea of like potlatch, right? There used to be potlatch ceremonies where people would come together a few times a year, right? It's like, oh, look, like I've got this abundance of deer skin and salmon and beads and these things, and you need this, and now I need this from you. It is the collective of taking care of each other, as like pie in the sky as that sounds, but it is that return to the sense of, as the Burn says, like, right, like us, not me, right? The thing of we're in this together, and if we return to an indigenous kind of mindset of, at the subatomic level, we are all the same. We're all related. If I am related to Mother Earth, if I am related to this tree, and that tree is my relative, and these buffalo are my relative, am I going to be so cavalier about just killing or raping and pillaging this resource? We have a long way to go because we are so, like, our society has fractalized us and taken us away from that. But that is, I think, where the hope lies. And it's those little everyday things, those little drops in the ocean, thinking about, everything. Am I buying a gift for someone? Does my friend like lotion? I don't know. Great. I go down to East Atlanta Farmers Market, and there is a Black woman there who makes this like amazing body butter. I'm putting my money there instead of Bath and Body Works, right? I love my little Keurig coffee pods. Am I ordering them from Starbucks or am I ordering them from native ground coffee, right? There are small things. Am I ordering off Amazon or am I going in Atlanta to Karis, the Black queer-owned bookstore? It is reallocating the resources that you have and becoming more conscious in these seemingly mundane everyday decisions. It's a lifestyle.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm sorry,
No, go
what
ahead,
you're
Chris. No,
saying
please, yeah.
sounds simple, but I didn't start thinking like this until the pandemic hit. And I was talking to a good friend, and they were talking about donating. They donated a lot of money to the Biden campaign. And I just started thinking, like, dang, like they could have paid someone's Wi-Fi for the year. They could have brought a family groceries. They could have gave that money to a local church to redistribute that money. So I think reallocating resources and being just conscious of how we spend our money and where we spend our money at, that alone would go a long way in moving past social trends.
Mm-hmm. And it's that willingness to sit with the discomfort, like you were talking about. It's bringing that into like our daily decisions too, right? Like if I order a book from Karis, I might be waiting for 5 days instead of having Amazon get it here by, tonight. But it's being willing to do that for the sake of the greater good. And that sounds small, but I do think that there is groundswell that happens there.
I kept thinking of this saying from like sports or just I don't even know within the Black community is like we all we got, we all we need, and like just over and like we all we got, we all we need, and like we're all we have and we're all we need. And as you were speaking of like just the elements and all that, like the five most abundant elements in the universe are found with us. So like literally we are stardust, we are the earth, and we need to get back. We need to take our shoes off and put our feet in the sand, put our feet in the dirt, get our hands dirty and reconnect, with place and know the place in the history of what it means to exist here and how we're all in humanity and community together. We have about 3 minutes left and we can definitely go over if we need to. But real quickly, what do you hope people take away from this conversation and as they move forward in their lives?
I hope people, well, obviously, if you're here, that says a lot. But just staying curious, I think is very important. Being inquisitive. I was thinking about back on a comment you said earlier, Josh, about like what if someone perceived the Black Panthers as militant, and just thinking about like, oh, isn't that the origin of this country? And it's interesting like what gets applauded and what doesn't in terms of our forefathers dumping tea to protest taxes and how that's applauded, but then Black people can't protect their own communities by making sure that police officers don't kill their neighbors. So really just being critical, questioning everything, and also coming with humility as well, because we all have privileges. We've all had opportunities that someone else hasn't. So just doing our best to dismantle these systems through just knowing ourselves better and just honoring who we are and the privileges that we have. I think that would go a long, long way.
Yeah, I think I would absolutely agree with that. And not being afraid to, as my spouse will often say, stare directly into the light, and also realizing it's a journey, it's an evolution. You're in it for the long game, but the awareness that every choice that we make, not to make it sound heavy, right? Because it's a beautiful thing, but every choice that I make, I have the opportunity to empower someone else, right? It is living simply so that others can simply live. I know that sounds like a bumper sticker. It probably is somewhere, right? But in not forgetting the power that you have as an engaged citizen. It's not to say, it's not like, oh, just go vote, it's going to be okay. No, that doesn't work. I live in a state where you can't even give somebody water if they're in a voting line. But it's just being aware of the power that you do have, the positionality. And again, just like asking who's not here, what empowerment steps can I make with this decision.
I want to thank you both for taking the time to be in conversation in community with me and with our audience. I look forward to the days to where we can be in person. And then just like, thank you everybody that was really engaged virtually in asking us questions and commenting. We really appreciate that. And I look forward to everyone's personal journey and, you know, getting involved and finding ways that together we can build our own collective and collectives to combat, resist, and change this country and build a society that is equitable for all of us. So thank you both for your time. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, evening, morning, wherever you're at in the world. Just thank you. Have a good one.
What an honor and a privilege to share this space with you. Thank you so very much.
Yeah, and I'm always down for follow-up conversations. So you can Google my name, University of Washington. I'm all over the School of Social Work website. So please email me if you have any follow-up conversations. Thank y'all for coming.
Likewise, lking3@emory.edu.